In the small but densely packed country of El Salvador, it had the dubious distinction of being one of the most dangerous places on Earth. The sun turns blood, and the moon shone on graveyards daily. But then, against all odds, a remarkable feat was achieved. How did El Salvador, this tiny nation, manage to conquer the seemingly insurmountable challenge of dismantling these powerful gangs? What sacrifices were made, and what uncomfortable choices were faced in the pursuit of freedom and security? Let's find out. The vaunted country. Before President Na Bukel took office in El Salvador, no government had succeeded in breaking up the country's notorious and dangerous street gangs. For years, security forces made mass arrests, and politicians sent waves of police officers and soldiers to reclaim control over impoverished urban communities where the government had lost its grip. They called these tough measures mano dura, or the iron fist approach. However, despite these efforts, little progress was made in the long run. The gangs, primarily the Mara Salvatrucha, MS-13, and the Barrio 18 factions, always found a way to regroup, strike back, or reorganize their operations under increased pressure. But now, things have changed. In March 2022, President Bukele's administration launched an unprecedented crackdown by declaring a state of emergency, granting his government nearly unlimited power to wage war against the gangs. This crackdown has resulted in the significant arrest of many gang members and their collaborators at the street level. It has disrupted their communication networks, hindered their ability to run extortion and drug trafficking businesses, which were their main sources of income. It has dismantled their command structure and thrown their hierarchies into disarray. It has temporarily hindered their ability to mount a collective and organized response, thereby leaving them stunned and struggling to regain their footing. The effectiveness of this crackdown has left analysts wondering why previous hardline security policies failed for so long, but are now suddenly yielding results. Here, we will take a closer look at how President Bukel's tough approach managed to overpower the gangs in El Salvador and the profound impact his government's campaign has had on the once dominant gang structures that shaped the country's criminal landscape. Life under gang rule in El Salvador. Between 2014 and 2017, almost 20,000 Salvadorans lost their lives, more than in several countries that were at war during that time, like Libya, Somalia, and Ukraine. The murder rate was shockingly high, reaching 103 per 100,000 people in 2015 and remaining at 60 per 100,000 in 2017. The main culprits behind these killings are the Maras, the powerful and pervasive criminal gangs in the country. The Maras, including the infamous MS-13, or Mara Salvatrucha, are active in 94% of El Salvador's 262 municipalities. In many of these areas, the gangs not only pose a constant threat to public safety, but also function as de facto authorities, exerting tremendous control over the daily lives of residents. In neighborhoods throughout the capital city, San Salvador, people going to work or school have to pass through informal checkpoints where young lookouts and errand runners for the gangs, known as banderas, ask everyone for $1. Shockingly, some of these banderas are as young as 8 years old. Most people pay up to avoid trouble, as refusing to do so can have dangerous consequences later. Extortion at businesses is an even bigger problem. Gang members, known as mareros, visit shops and stalls in the neighborhood market once a week to collect protection money, or renta, from merchants who cannot afford their own security guards. Once again, most shopkeepers pay to avoid retaliation. Defying the gangs means risking one's life. The largest maras in El Salvador are MS-13 and the two factions of Barrio 18, the Revolutionaries and the Southerners. These three organizations have around 65,000 members according to police records. However, many more people, approximately 500,000 in total, depend on the gangs for their livelihood. There is deep-seated animosity between rival gangs. MS-13 members refuse to say the number 18. For example, if asked their age, they would say, "I'm 17 plus 1." The boundaries of the gang's territories are invisible but widely known and rarely crossed. A young person living in MS-13 territory, but with a grandmother in Barrio 18 territory, can only meet her in neutral ground or in a place where their identities are unknown. Gang-related murders are a topic of everyday conversation among families, school children, and people in bars. Almost every Salvadoran knows someone who has been killed by gang members or someone who has pulled the trigger. Many Salvadorans avoid public places and even walking on the streets. The wealthy often stay within gated compounds. After sunset, many streets in San Salvador become deserted. The night belongs to the maras, who are most active during that time. It is also when the army and police conduct house-to-house searches for criminal suspects. Police officers always wear face-covering balaclavas, fearing that gang members will target them and their families. The climate of fear is so intense that thousands of families have abandoned their homes and fled north towards the U.S. border. Reina, a 13-year-old woman, left her small community in central El Salvador with her sister and 3 children after the gangs moved in. One of the gang members threw a homemade bomb into her neighbor's house, killing 4 people. Another gang member shot her brother, a former government soldier who was seen as an enemy by the gang. The gang warned the rest of the family to leave. Gangs often seize houses in strategic locations and convert them into crazy houses, or casas locas. If a family refuses to leave, the gang threatens all its members. The casas locas serve as hangouts where gang members gather to smoke, drink, and initiate new recruits. They may also take neighborhood women and girls there to subject them to sexual abuse. One reason why gangs have been able to establish such deep roots in El Salvador is that they provide a sense of pride and belonging to their members, many of whom come from poor and broken families. The maras are important when you have nothing, when you are born dead, says Salvadoran anthropologist Juan José Martínez do Buisson. Gangs also claim to provide a community service by protecting locals from other criminals and corrupt police. An unnamed MS-13 spokesperson told the Salvadoran news site El Faro, "The state has abandoned these territories, and we have taken control of what it left behind. We come from broken families and extreme poverty. The only force that exists in our communities is the gangs. However, Salvadorans pay protection money and comply with the gangs' demands out of fear of retaliation, not out of loyalty or gratitude. You can't work anywhere without permission from the local gang," says Alex, a 46-year-old former construction worker who decided to leave El Salvador when job opportunities dried up in his hometown. He had to make a choice between leaving or submitting to gang rule in another part of the country. In the United States, politicians use the criminal and social power of MS-13 to promote an anti-immigration agenda. The Trump administration has been deporting tens of thousands of Salvadorans who have no involvement with the gangs, and they are also refusing entry to thousands more who are victims of the maras' predatory activities. In January 2018, the U.S. announced that it would terminate the temporary protected status designation in September 2019, which had allowed 195,000 Salvadorans to live and work legally in the U.S. for nearly 20 years. In June, then Attorney General Jeff Sessions further restricted eligibility for asylum, stating that having experienced gang violence would no longer be sufficient grounds to seek asylum in the U.S. Origin of the gang. In the United States, particularly in Los Angeles, Latino neighborhoods were divided into different sections, including the Chinese neighborhood, the Black neighborhood, and the Latino neighborhood. Within the Latino population, there were 2 significant groups: Mexicans and Salvadorans. Salvadorans began to establish a presence in Los Angeles between 1980 and 1992, which coincided with the Salvadoran Civil War. During the Civil War, people from all walks of life were leaving El Salvador. Entire families, young individuals, as well as deserters from both the army and the guerrilla sought to escape the violence. In Los Angeles, these Latino groups, similar to African American groups, faced challenging and marginalized lives. Originally, these gangs emerged as self-defense groups, aiming to protect the Latino community and their neighborhoods from encroachment and harm from other areas. One phrase commonly used by many of these gangs was "Vivo por mi madre, muero por mi barrio." I live for my mother, I die for my neighborhood. It represented a commitment to defend the community from abuses. So how did these gangs from Los Angeles establish themselves in El Salvador? In the 1990s, as the gang phenomenon in Los Angeles became more complex, the United States started deporting gang members. These deportations transported back to El Salvador numerous gang members who had committed crimes and even murders in the United States. Upon their return to El Salvador, the Civil War had ended, but the country faced numerous challenges. There was a lack of clarity on how to handle these deported individuals, and the infrastructure was insufficient. The National Police Force was still in its infancy, having been established in 1992 with the peace agreements and composed of former military and guerrilla members. These circumstances made it difficult to address the gang problem effectively. The deportation of gang members back to El Salvador coincided with a complex social environment in the country. Family structures were broken, both financially and culturally. Violence has always been present in El Salvador, with a history of conflict, including the violent past of the Civil War and the extermination of indigenous people in 1932. It seems that violence has become ingrained in the country's identity, making it challenging to imagine El Salvador without it. Unfortunately, these gangs turned to criminal activities due to a lack of reintegration policies and support from the government. The absence of serious government programs left young people in a state of abandonment, and predatory behavior, such as killing and extortion, gained traction. The gangs transitioned into criminal organizations, with extortion becoming a prominent activity. Now, do you think there is a political ideology associated with these gangs? Typically, these gangs do not have a political ideology. They tend to align themselves with political parties that they perceive as being in their best interest, or ones that respect them. They may support parties that do not repress them. Ultimately, the gangs fight over what they represent and their sense of identity. They have always been rivals among themselves, and these rivalries were fueled by the post-war environment in El Salvador. These young people lived in marginalized conditions, often worse off than their experiences in the U.S. While they may have had some options in the U.S. in post-war El Salvador, with limited resources, infrastructure, and a lack of comprehensive focus on the problem, they faced more marginalization and repression. It is disheartening to note that children as young as 7 or 8 years old can be found involved with these gangs. However, the most common age range for gang initiation is between 12 and 16 years old. Subscribers pick. Once in the small country of El Salvador, there were powerful and terrifying gangs that caused havoc and fear in the streets. Peering into this picture, one would think these were political gangs, but no. These guys masked in deep tattoos turned into a nightmare in their thousands. It showed how El Salvador destroyed their brutal gangs changes everything. The government knew it had to take action to keep its people safe and bring an end to the gang violence. So, just at the peak of time, the president declared a state of emergency, giving the security forces more power to capture the gang members. With this new authority, the police and soldiers worked together tirelessly, arresting gang members and their helpers. You would think it was a smooth ride, but never. It was a bloodbath. They conducted surprise raids and acted quickly, making thousands of arrests in just a few months. The government also passed stricter laws to keep the gang members in prison for longer. Was that good enough for Marfians who have sent innocent lives to early graves? Tell us what you think in the comments section. Legal measures and political power. The crackdown on these gangs began when the government declared a state of emergency, which is a temporary measure used in response to major disasters like earthquakes or pandemics. This was the first time the Salvadoran government had taken this approach to deal with gangs. The decision was made after a series of brutal gang massacres in March 2022, where 87 people were killed. The president's request to enforce a one-month state of emergency was approved by legislators aligned with Bukele. Since then, the state of emergency has been extended for 20 consecutive months, and it is expected to be renewed again in December. Under the emergency laws, Salvadorans have been deprived of basic constitutional rights, such as the right to have a lawyer and the freedom to move around. The rules for making arrests have been relaxed, and the state has been given permission to intercept civilian communications. These emergency powers have allowed the security forces to launch a swift and forceful attack on the gangs. They have been able to arrest gang members and suspected collaborators without a warrant or based on anonymous tips. This has resulted in a much higher rate of arrests compared to previous crackdowns. In the first 2 months of the state of emergency, over 33,000 people were arrested, according to police intelligence data. The state of emergency has also suspended constitutional rights to defense, meaning that detainees can be held indefinitely without an arrest warrant or evidence to support criminal allegations. Detainees also lose the right to have a court hearing within 72 hours of arrest, and lawyers and civil society organizations have reported difficulties in communicating with those detained. Arrests have been made based on unverified intelligence, rumors, and information from social media profiles. The government has also implemented new laws to keep gang members in prison. Jail sentences for gang membership have been increased, and house arrest is no longer an option for detainees belonging to terrorist groups. Gangs are considered terrorist organizations under Salvadoran law. The age at which people can be tried for gang-related crimes has been lowered to 12. The government has expanded existing anti-gang laws to apply them to a wider range of targets. Anyone who promotes, helps, facilitates, or favors the activities of a criminal organization can be arrested under the law on unlawful association. This gives authorities the power to arrest not only suspected gang members, but also aspiring members and suspected collaborators. The government does not provide clear definitions for these positions or explain how it determines who falls into each category. Nonetheless, this has become a major reason for arrests during the state of emergency. The government has significant control over various parts of the government. Bukele's party, Nuevas Ideas, used its majority in the Legislative Assembly to enact the state of emergency and has continued to extend it. Legislators loyal to Bukele passed the legal reforms related to the crackdown. The Legislative Assembly also removed many judges from the judiciary and appointed replacements with connections to the Bukele administration. The courts have remained silent despite allegations of state abuses and violations of due process. The Attorney General's office, which is aligned with the Bukele administration, has worked closely with the security forces to facilitate mass arrests with little or no evidence. Despite the transformative impact of the government's crackdown on gangs in El Salvador, the gangs are not completely eradicated. The government's own data contradicts the narrative put forth by the Bukele administration that the gangs have been completely defeated. According to a police intelligence report obtained by Insight Crime, the government claims to have arrested a significant number of gang members. This includes 52,541 members of MS-13, 13,682 members of Barrio 18 Sureños, and 10,741 members of Barrio 18 Revolucionarios. The figures encompass different categories of gang affiliation, such as homeboys, chequeos, meaning aspiring members, and collaborators. The report also states that among those arrested were 1,000 232 gang leaders, with 945 from MS-13. However, the same police intelligence report reveals that a significant portion of gang members and collaborators remain at large. As of the end of September 2023, over 42,000 individuals, constituting 36% of gang members and collaborators, were still not apprehended. Furthermore, the data highlights that more than half of the reported detainees during the state of emergency are not full-fledged gang members. Homeboys accounted for 32,331 arrests, 42%, suspected collaborators accounted for 41,733 arrests, 54%, and Chequeos accounted for 3,435 arrests, 4%, as of September 30th, 2023. These statistics indicate that while the government has made substantial arrests, there is still a significant number of gang members and collaborators who have evaded capture. Additionally, a significant proportion of those detained under the state of emergency are individuals who may have limited involvement or association with the gangs, rather than core members. It showed how El Salvador destroyed their brutal gangs changes everything. These findings challenge the narrative that the gangs have been completely defeated and highlight the ongoing challenges in addressing the gang issue in El Salvador. Massive territorial wipeout. The clearest sign that gangs are less present in El Salvador is that the MS-13 and Barrio 18 are no longer seen in neighborhoods where they used to have control. Before the government declared a state of emergency, these gangs had a strong hold in many urban areas throughout the country. To maintain control, the gangs relied on a network of lower-ranking members and collaborators who acted as lookouts and informants. They enforced rules in the communities they controlled, such as restrictions on movement and prohibitions on certain crimes like rape. They punished those who broke the rules, even though they often broke them themselves. Gang members also settled disputes among residents instead of involving the police or other authorities. In some cases, the police didn't even enter areas heavily influenced by the MS-13 and Barrio 18. Things have changed dramatically since the state of emergency was enacted. Insight Crime visited 15 neighborhoods in various municipalities where the gangs were once dominant and found that their influence has almost completely disappeared. Before the state of emergency, people needed gang permission to travel through disputed territories, even for everyday activities or emergencies. The gangs also controlled the local economy, deciding who could sell what and where. Now, residents say they no longer feel constantly watched by the gangs, and they are not restricted in moving between different communities. They have reclaimed public spaces that were previously controlled by the gangs and have started new community projects without facing resistance. For example, inter-community soccer tournaments, previously limited by gang territorial boundaries, have resumed since the state of emergency began. Few residents reported seeing any remaining presence of the gangs in their neighborhoods. Some mentioned seeing former gang members who were released from prison, but they said these individuals had much less power than before the state of emergency. There were concerns about possible retaliation from released gang members if residents reported them to the police, but there have been no reports of revenge attacks against civilians. Police officers in San Salvador's historic center, where gangs used to be active in informal markets, said that the gangs disappeared within just 2 weeks of the state of emergency. Another security official mentioned that schools may be the only public spaces where remnants of the gangs can still operate, as they may be housing gang-affiliated minors. However, residents in Apopa and San Miguel didn't see this as a major issue. The situation may be different in rural areas, where gang members sought refuge after security forces started cracking down on gang-controlled neighborhoods in major cities. There are sporadic reports of gangs still engaging in extortion in rural zones, indicating that some gang structures still exist, though in a reduced form. An instant halt. The gangs in El Salvador have suffered significant losses of territory and manpower, which has severely impacted their ability to operate the criminal economies that have sustained them. In the past, the gangs resorted to brutal violence, including killing people, if they failed to pay. However, residents in the neighborhoods previously controlled by the gangs have reported that they are no longer receiving extortion threats. Some residents have also mentioned that they haven't witnessed any gang retaliation for not paying extortion fees during the state of emergency. Extortion in the transportation sector has also come to a halt. Bus company representatives in San Salvador have stated that the gangs quickly stopped charging extortion fees following the beginning of the state of emergency. A bus company owner who used to pay thousands of dollars in monthly extortion fees to the gangs said he stopped making payments as soon as the crackdown started, and the demands from the gangs ceased. The inability to continue their extortion activities, especially in the informal economy, represents a significant financial blow to the gangs. El Salvador's police have reported a 54% reduction in extortion complaints compared to the same period in the previous year. The decrease in gang extortion can be directly attributed to the state of emergency, as the gangs no longer have enough members on the streets to demand and collect extortion payments. Many of their collaborators and relatives have been arrested or are hiding to avoid arrest. However, there are still reports of extortion persisting in some areas, albeit on a smaller scale. Some individuals may be continuing the practice on behalf of remnants of the gangs or as independent actors. Police officials and municipal employees have acknowledged that despite the near-complete disappearance of the gang's presence in certain establishments, there are still instances of extortion occurring. The mayor of San Miguel has mentioned that while extortion hasn't been completely eradicated, some gang members are now seeking collaboration from households as an alternative, smaller-scale source of revenue. During the state of emergency, the security forces have also arrested individuals for extortion who do not appear to have any direct links to the gangs. Thank you for watching and see you in the next video.